Hey, KZUM HD. Welcome to Canine 360. We're here with you on Wednesdays, talking dogs and all things dog related, and sometimes expanding our conversation to include other kinds of canines, even the wild ones. I'm Jill, and I'm here with you each week to see what we can see. And hope you're having a good January so far, and getting out with your dog even on the days when it's too cold to be out there together for very long. Keep an eye on those puppy dog feet, although they handle the cold better than we do, I think. And they handle the heat less well than we do. But that is a discussion for a past show or a future show. Maybe both, and we'll see if we can get round to that. But I wanted to bring something to you that I thought was absolutely fascinating. It's a story from the New York Times from January 3rd, last week. And maybe it's just the juxtaposition of the stories, but I was on that, what do they call it? It's that neighborhood chat. I subscribe to it through one of my email addresses. I think it's called Neighborhood. Anyway, there are opportunities to participate all over the city, and you can see folks posting from whatever part of Lincoln they live in, whether it's the country club or the various other neighborhoods, right? And there was a story about, or a post from a fellow who lived out 120th and Holdridge or thereabouts, right on the east side of town, and he had taken let his little toy dog, Chihuahua-looking dog, outside at 11:15 p.m. and was genuinely distressed that the dog, who was outside by itself, had been snatched by a coyote. And I think folks who have lived their entire lives in rural areas will chuckle or roll their eyes when you can't see them, and figure that if you don't want your toy dog to be bait for the wild canines whose habitat we keep encroaching on, perhaps you put them on a leash and go out there with them, especially at the times of day when they're likely to be hunting. And lo, what to my wondrous eyes did appear, to quote the poet, was a story in the New York Times called "The Ghost Wolves of Galveston Island." And if you want to look it up, that's the title of the story, "The Ghost Wolves of Galveston Island." And it appeared in the New York Times January 3rd by a journalist named Emily Anthes, Anthes. What's interesting and remarkable as well about the story that I can't bring you here are the photographs of these wolves that are elusive yet almost omnipresent, a presence that's sensed but not so often seen, occasionally glimpsed, and as you might imagine, a species around whom there has evolved a great deal of story and superstition and even Sasquatch caliber apprehension. So let me hit the highlights for you because it's pretty interesting. This is Galveston Island, Texas, and the journalist tells us that from a distance, these wolves, these canids, look almost like coyotes. They prowl around the beach at night and their eyes gleam in the dark. But if you can get closer, or if you can look closer, there's something odd about them, curious about them. That their bodies seem out of proportion. They have overly long legs, unusually broad heads, and very sharply pointed noses. And their fur is distinctly red, but they have big white patches on their muzzle or on their face. And from there, we learn that the Galveston Island canids are not conventional coyotes, at least not entirely, that they carry a ghostly genetic legacy, DNA from red wolves in the United States, which were declared extinct in the wild in 1980. So apparently, according to Ms. Anthes, our journalist here, these genes have been hiding in plain sight, tucked away in the unremarkable animals that scavenge for food on Galveston Island in Texas. You can see them, probably not unlike the coyotes on the edges or in the central parts of Lincoln, scavenging around housing developments and roaming the grounds at the local airport. So we go on to learn that their discovery, which came after a determined local resident persuaded scientists to take a little closer look at these canids, could help revive a captive breeding program for red wolves and restore the rich genetic variation that once existed in a wild population, but had been thought to be lost. According to Bridget von Holt, who's an evolutionary biologist at Princeton University, and commenting on the genetic diversity that once characterized red wolves, she said, "It doesn't seem to be lost any longer. We might have a chance to bring it back." And these Galveston Island canids emerged from the dark. They're not entirely coyotes, as they carry DNA from red wolves, again, declared to be extinct in 1980. So this Galveston resident, a guy named Ron Wooten, we're told in our New York Times story, didn't pay a whole lot of attention to the local coyotes until they ran off with his dog one night in 2008. And he said they just didn't look right. That a pack of these coyotes took the dog, carried him off, and he later found the pack and what remained of his dog in a nearby field, and he was horrified, right, and blamed himself for the dog's death. But as his flashlight swept over the coyotes' red muzzles, he was fascinated. He was determined to learn more, so he posted a message on Facebook, right? This is what we do, asking his neighbors to alert him if they saw any of these animals. And a friend eventually came through, posting that she had seen a pack near her apartment building. So Mr. Wooten used to be an outreach specialist at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, so he has kind of an interest in some sciencey stuff, right? So the story tells us that he raced over with his camera, snapping pictures as he watched a group of pups chasing each other, and remarked on that. He said they were just beautiful. But when he got home and was able to look more carefully at the photos, he began to wonder whether these so-called coyotes were really coyotes at all. They just didn't look right, he said. I thought at first they must have been bred with Marmaduke or something because they had these super long legs and these super long noses. And as a former fisheries biologist, he suspected the canids might be coyote red wolf hybrids, and he started collecting genetic samples from roadkill. Right? And there's pictures of all of this if you can go to this New York Times website. The pictures are really pretty fascinating. So Steve Parker, a lawyer from League City, Texas, joined Mr. Wooten in advocating further study of these canids. And Wooten started reading up on the local wildlife. In his research, he stumbled across the history of red wolves. They were once abundant in the southeastern United States, but the wolves had dwindled in numbers during the 20th century, a result of loss of their habitat, hunting, and other threats. And in the 1970s, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service made a last-ditch effort to save the species, traveling along the Gulf Coast, trapping all the red wolves it could find. And they selected, the scientists participating in this thing, selected some of the animals for a breeding program in hopes of maintaining the red wolf in captivity. Well, back to our story, Mr. Wooten became convinced that the creatures that had taken his dog were actually red wolf coyote hybrids, if not actual red wolves. So he got kind of excited about proving his hypothesis, and we're told that he began looking for dead canids by the side of the road. I was thinking if these are red wolves, then the only way they're going to be able to tell is with genetics, he told Emily Anthes, the journalist reporting this story. He actually did find 2 dead animals, collected a small patch of skin from each and tucked them away in his freezer, while he tried for years to pique the interest of various scientists. He's quoted as saying, sometimes they would respond and sometimes they'd say, yeah, that's a neat animal, nothing we can do about it. Or, they're extinct, it's not a red wolf. Well, so from 2008 to 2016, 8 long years. Eventually, 2016, Mr. Wooten's photos made their way to Dr. Von Holt, the biologist at Princeton that we just heard from. She's an expert on canid genetics, and the animals in Mr. Wooten's photos immediately struck her. They had a special look, she said, and I bit the whole thing, hook, line, and sinker. She asked him to send his specimens, but there was a glitch because by then he had lost one, right, while he was waiting. So he packed up the tissue he could find, threw in the scalpel he'd used to prepare the other sample, hoping it maybe had some DNA that could be extracted. And Dr. Von Holt said it was really just kind of lovely chaos, and that the scientists did manage to pull DNA from the scalpel, but Mr. Wooten later did find his second sample, so he mailed that in too. Meanwhile, Dr. Von Holt and her colleagues extracted DNA from those skin samples and compared it to DNA from coyotes, red wolves, gray wolves, and eastern wolves. And although the 2 Galveston Island canids were mostly coyote, they had significant red wolf ancestry, about 30%. 30% of their genetic material came from the wolves. And Dr. Von Holt said the canids harbor ancestral genetic variation, what she called a ghost variation, which we thought was extinct from the landscape. I don't know about you, but I think this is just so cool, right? The ghost wolves. So the canids, in a photograph, here's a caption, tunneled under a fence between the airport and the golf course where they're seen regularly. So I'm telling you, folks, you got to go get on the New York Times archive page and check this out. So Kristen Brzezinski gets involved. She's a conservation geneticist and a postdoc in Dr. Von Holt's lab at the time, and she says it was a real validation, I think, to the people on the ground, the naturalists and the photographers on the ground, saying, we have something special here. And they do, because we can actually start understanding what was the historical red wolf, and think about reconstructing that animal, right? When I read that paragraph, I thought, like Jurassic Park, except with wolves. Maybe. Mr. Wooten was thrilled. He said, it blew me away. And even more remarkably, some of the genetic variants or alleles that the Galveston animals carried were not present in any of the other North American canids the researchers analyzed, including contemporary red wolves. The scientists theorized that these alleles were passed down from the wild red wolves that used to roam that region of Texas. Dr. Von Holt is quoted as saying they harbor ancestral genetic variation, this ghost variation, which we thought was extinct from the landscape, and so there's this sense of reviving what we thought was gone. So the researchers suspect that some red wolves evaded the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service dragnet back in the 1970s. Remember, they were trying to round them up, see if they could breed them in captivity? Dr. Von Holt said there was surely a little slippery one that got away. or maybe even a couple of them. And at some point, the red wolves or their descendants bred with local coyotes, and not just in Texas. In 2018, the same year that Dr. von Holt's team published its findings, another group documented high levels of red wolf ancestry in wild canids in Louisiana. So, our intrepid journalist, Emily Anthes, writing in the New York Times, tells us that the findings could help scientists understand the genetic variation that once existed in wild red wolves and even resurrect it. Dr. Brzezinski said we can actually start understanding what the historical red wolf was and think about reconstructing that animal. And she's now finished her PhD and is at Michigan Tech up in Houghton. So in the late 1980s, we learn, some of the red wolves from the captive breeding program were released in North Carolina, but that experimental population has plummeted in recent years. Officials in North Carolina estimate that fewer than 20 of the animals now patrol the Carolina coast. And all the red wolves alive today are descended from about a dozen animals, which is an extremely low level of genetic diversity, right? You don't want too small a gene pool. That could further imperil the species. So this is where hybrids can help, because these hybrids, this coyote red wolf combination, raise new conservation possibilities. For example, scientists might be able to restore genetic diversity by carefully breeding red wolves to hybrids with high levels of red wolf ancestry. Or, according to Dr. von Holt, they could use artificial reproductive technologies or even gene editing techniques to insert the ghost alleles back into the red wolves. Excuse me. The findings also come as some scientists have been rethinking the value of interspecies hybrids. Dr. Brzezinski says oftentimes hybridization is viewed as a real threat to the integrity of a species, which it can be. But one reason that the red wolf populations declined in the wild is because the animals frequently interbred with coyotes. So she added, here we have these hybrids that are now potentially going to be the lifeline for the restoration, maybe, of the highly endangered red wolf. So the discovery of hybrids in both Texas and Louisiana suggests scientists and officials may want to refocus their red wolf conservation efforts on those areas. And now we're hearing from Lizette Waits, and she's a conservation geneticist at the University of Idaho and co-author of the 2018 paper on the Louisiana hybrids. She said that in addition to studying the hybrids, it might make sense to reintroduce captive-bred red wolves to those regions where animals with red wolf genes still roam the landscape. Dr. Waits says it could completely change the direction of the red wolf recovery program. So now Dr. Brzezinski, Dr. von Holt, and their collaborators are studying hybrids in both Texas and Louisiana as part of a new project called the Gulf Coast Canine Project. They are using GPS collars and wildlife cameras to learn more about canids' movements and behaviors. They're collecting fecal samples to analyze their diets, and using genetic analysis to trace pack relatedness, collecting tissue samples from animals with the most red wolf ancestry. According to Dr. von Holt, one goal is to create a biobank set of specimens that could be used to help increase the genetic health of the captive red wolf population. This team and their collaborators and the Gulf Coast Canine Project, which now I'm going to have to Google because now I'm curious about that. According to the New York Times article, they are also hoping to learn more about how these red wolf alleles have persisted especially in animals that live closer to humans in a popular tourist destination like Galveston Island. The island setting, which keeps the canids relatively reproductively isolated, is probably part of the explanation, but so is the lack of persecution, right? Because the animals are not commonly hunted. Think about, the feral dogs that might live on the landfill that's adjacent to a seaside village in Mexico. Or I have two friends who used to travel regularly to Nepal, who worked for, they were limnologists, and they spoke frequently to me of the Nepalese dogs who are adjacent to every segment of the Nepalese human population, but they are feral. They're not owned. They breed randomly. They're there and present, ubiquitous, almost like squirrels and rabbits are in our community here, but canines, right? So these Galveston ghost wolves, in some way, especially on the island, are maybe analogous to that. Mr. Wooten now is not the only local resident who's taken an interest in the ghost wolves. The research team that are following them also works closely with Josh Henderson, who's the animal services supervisor at the Galveston Police Department, and there's considerable community support for the canids. We're going to get back to that in just a second. The New York Times article ends by telling us that Steve Parker, who's a lawyer that grew up in the area, remembers hearing childhood stories about his relatives trapping red wolves. And for him, the Galveston canids have helped him connect with older generations, many of whom have passed away. And he's quoted as saying, "I'd like to see something and maybe eventually even touch something that was special to them." And Mr. Wooten, for his part, dreams of setting up an educational center devoted to teaching the public about these unique animals. He's quoted, "The possibility of what these animals hold down here is pretty valuable. And that's the reason I pursued it, I think. I think God was thumping me on the head and saying, hey, I've got animals here. Take care of them." So there's the powerful ending to a really nice story called The Ghost Wolves of Galveston Island. If you're looking for it, you can find it in the New York Times, January 3rd. Author of the story is Emily Anthes, Anthes, if that helps your Google search. And it's worth a Google glance, if only for the photographs, which are totally mesmerizing, and actually take up more space than the column inches devoted to the story. So the pictures, they're truly remarkable. But I like this idea, right, of community members working together, researchers, residents, and supervisors of animal services to safely study, count, maintain a wild species in an urban environment. And maybe that's not so much of what I see when I see local coverage of the, quote, coyote invasion and people who want Lincoln Animal Control to come out and deal with coyotes in some way, which doesn't strike me as the wisest way, most thoughtful way, or most responsible way. I think we have to be responsible for our dogs and their whereabouts. Not that you've never heard that before here, right? And I love this quote from Mr. Wooten. The possibility of what these animals hold down here is pretty valuable. And he's right about the conservation efforts and the maintenance of a species or the restoration of a species once thought to be extinct. But that last sentence, that last line, I think God was thumping me on the head and saying, hey, I got animals here. Take care of them. Not just your Chihuahua dog. That one's not the only animal. Right? All right, you guys. That's the end of our time here on this Winter Wednesday. Thanks as always for your listening ear, for your support and sustaining efforts as we try to bring you things here on Canine 360 and on KZUM that you can't find anywhere else. More wolf talk next week. So come back and join us. In the meantime, stick around. Celebration is up next. And you don't want to miss a thing anyway, right? Hang out with us here all the time on KZUM and KZUM HD, the coolest radio station in the world. Keep warm. I'll see you back here next week.